Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you have enjoyed Mike and Matt and Ed and Christian. We hope to get the Ed Usset audio edited post-production here, just to even out some of the, his, maybe amp up his volume and decrease my volume so it doesn't blast your speakers when you listen to it. So how's my audio right now? Just want to check with people. Can you hear everything good? Sounds awesome. So I'm just going to jump into it. I'm the founder of Harvest Profit. I've worked with a bunch of farms all across the country in a farm management, risk management consulting role. And on top of that, in addition to that, I've seen the financials, the infrastructure of hundreds of farms. And so, obviously some farms are in a position of success because of factors outside of their control, whether that's inheritance, really low family rent. There's a couple different factors that give a person a natural tailwind. I'm just going to forget about those and focus on the controllable traits that I have seen in financially successful farms. And I'm going to dive right in here. The first one is, a lot of the successful guys I've worked with, and I'm, in my mind, I'm picking guys that, have put themselves in really solid financial situations. So if you pulled up their balance sheet today, they have tremendous amounts of working capital, really risk-free. These guys, by the nature of farming, just tend to be older. Paying down debt increases equity. Increases the ability to add working capital to the balance sheet. So just by the nature of this, there are older operations in here, but not saying that I do know plenty of younger farms that are well on the way to a path of financial success and kind of balance sheet freedom, I call it. And the first trait is just not fixating on uncontrollables. And what are uncontrollables? You have many of them. Mother Nature, the markets, just random BS that happens on your farm. That's, the unfortunate nature of farming is that the two main drivers of your revenue, the markets and the weather, are completely outside of your control. And it gets really easy to, fixate on them, complain about them. But these solid farmers that I tend to hold in high regard, they're just very even-keeled. They know that the bad weather is going to be counterbalanced by the good weather. They understand the certain market cycles, whether it's big longer-term cycles like Dr. Roberts talked about, or shorter-term year-to-year cycles, and just really even-keeled, frankly nice. Nearly every one of them is very nice. That's something I didn't even touch on here, but as I'm thinking about just the behavioral patterns of not riding the emotional roller coaster of uncontrollable events, these people tend to just be really nice. That's a very common trait. So if we have these uncontrollable factors in your operation, what can we do about that? What can we do to help kind of weather all the uncertainty and the volatility that's thrown at you and at your farm? I really think it comes down to an analytical approach. And on top of that is what I call an ABT approach to your farm, and that's always be testing. And so when you're conducting tests, oftentimes what happens is we focus on the results. Was that a successful result or an unsuccessful result? And before we get to the result phase, we need to really understand the factors that impacted that result. So always be testing, always be analytical, and try to do some after the fact attribution analysis. What attributed to this result? Was that factor in my control? What was the cost? What would be the cost of protecting against that in the future? Whether it's a different grain, making more aggressive grain sales, buying different insurance, putting on a fungicide, buying a put option? What would be the cost of the protection against that uncertain or negative outcome? And what can I do different next time? I know in my business, I've really had to get disciplined about documenting things that are going on. I used to be able to store more and more stuff in my head, and that, as we get older, as our business problems get more complex, we just can't do that. So always documenting, whether it's the weather factors that impact a split test you do on your farm, or if you're making an uncomfortable marketing decision, throw up a note and say, hey, on this day I sold this grain and here's why. And so you can look back and learn from it, and then be analytical in your approach. Obviously some things are going to go your way, some things aren't going to go your way, but what can you control? What's the cost of controlling that? And what can you do different next time? And so, some different tools that a person can use is just document your learnings. Google Docs is a really great way to just kind of create a running journal of learnings on your farm. There's a couple additional tools called Trello and Notion. They're very flexible ways to document what you have going on, standard operating procedures, split tests, basically just a really flexible way to track things that are going on in your farm. And then in addition, it's good to have trusted, confidential peers that you can, maybe you have to blow off some steam. You get 6 inches of rain the last week in May, and yeah, you do need to blow off some steam. So trusted peers to vent, and then trusted peers that will help flag your irrationality. It's good to have people that'll call you if you're being irrational about something going on in your farm business. And then the third is just kind of checking the box and moving on. If you have documented some things you could do better, some things you would do different in the future, or maybe an event is just completely random and it was completely outside of your control, move on. Don't focus on the past. Don't fixate on wild future predictions, but just move on today with your eyes pointing forward. And just like I alluded to earlier, don't let this volatility and all these uncontrollable factors, really weigh you down. There is a lot of research on the fact that the less control you have over things in your life, the less happy you are. Unfortunately, in farming, we have the weather and the markets that we have no control over. So do your best to document them. Do your best to move on. It'll make your business more productive. It'll make your life more gratifying. And so all in all, trait number one is just don't fixate on the uncontrollable events. Try to do attribution analysis, document your learnings, always be testing. The second trait is I have noticed a solid tendency of these financially successful farms having a good board of advisors. A bunch of local successful farms I work with, or that I know, material amount of them work with the same tax advisor who's given them very solid advice over the years. Many of them are great at agronomy, but they have an agronomist on staff or as a consultant to help be a sounding board for their decisions. And this can go on the legal side, obviously the risk management side, but it's really hard to be an expert at everything. As you see this guy here, farmers wear so many hats. You're a manager, you're a laborer, oftentimes you're a mechanic, you're an economist, you're a risk manager, you're an accountant, you're a bookkeeper. All of those things, it's hard to be great. It's hard to be an expert at everything. And it's just hard to balance all of those activities. And so the solution is surrounding yourself with people that will give you honest feedback. You don't want a yes man. You want a banker who will give you honest advice. You want a tax accountant, a bookkeeper that you see eye to eye with. You want somebody on the risk management side of your farm. Maybe it's just a merchandiser, or maybe it's a consultant or a newsletter, somebody that will supplement your weaknesses. And on the agronomy side, some people really value an agronomist. Some people do it themselves. But at the end of the day, a lot of these farms that I've got to know have solid advisory relationships on all sides of their business, because once again, nobody can be perfect at everything. We have a couple keys here. Once again, they need to be pushing back on you. They need to be just like I said, they can't be yes men. You need to find and attack your weakness. Maybe you just find yourself, not doing the appropriate crop scouting that you should be. The days just tick by the calendar, and you're busy in the shop, or you're busy doing the books, and the crop scouting doesn't get done. Supplement that, fill in that weakness. The same with the risk management side. If you find yourself consistently watching profitable opportunities go by, supplement yourself with somebody who's an expert. It doesn't necessarily have to be a person. I think oftentimes it should be, but find somebody that you work good with. There's nothing wrong with interviewing risk managers, agronomists, bookkeepers, maybe a little less so on the banking side, but find somebody who agrees with your philosophies, who will push back and supplements your weaknesses. The other key, in addition to attacking your weaknesses, is at the end of the day, you still have to own your decisions. I personally am not a big fan of just offloading all of your decisions to somebody else. Just like Christian mentioned this morning, instead of going to the banker and kind of getting down on a knee and begging them for some expansion capital to buy land, you should be in the position where you can go to the banker with a plan in place. I'd like to borrow, $700,000 on 25-year amortization at, 5% interest, and I'd like it to be fixed for the whole term. And here's what my working capital would look like afterwards. So you have to own the decision. Having a good banker, a lot of farms I've met, the banker, they look to the banker as the boss. The banker should be on the same level as you. Your business is extremely valuable to a bank. The amount of interest that farmers generate for banks, for the on average, for the amount of work it takes, you guys are a big profit sector to financial institutions. And so it should be a peer relationship where they should be working for you. They should provide an advice. But at the end of the day, you have to own the decision, and you should be controlling the relationship. I'm a big believer that you need to really understand you shouldn't just send off your numbers at the end of the year and have the accountant come back to you and say, here's how much money you should spend, or here's how much revenue you should bring in, or somebody just going through and doing your books and you just seeing the results. Those are two things you need to own, you need to understand. They are your business. Your balance sheet is a reflection of all of the work and effort and your skills as a farmer. You need to own and understand that, and feel free to push back. Why should I spend $462,000 after this good year? Feel free to push back. But at the end of the day, you need to own the decisions. Risk management side is the same thing. I'm personally not a fan of just offloading the risk management via a pro pricing contract or giving somebody power of attorney control. If you go back to our previous trait of don't fixate on the uncontrollable, if you just hand off your risk management to somebody else, odds are that they're gonna, they're not gonna do a whole lot worse than what the average market price is, but you're not really taking any control off you're not really taking any uncertainty off the table. You're just allowing somebody else to make that decision. So I'm a big fan on the risk management side. You should own those decisions. On the agronomy side, what I've seen over the years is each one of these individuals, your tax accountant, your banker, your agronomist, your risk manager, they all have a bias. And one bias is to make you happy. They want you to be happy, to keep the relationship with them. An agronomist can keep your, a lot of times their incentive is to keep your fields clean. And I've seen, especially the last few years, some costs for chemicals just getting really out of whack, talking $50, $60 an acre in chemicals. Yeah, your fields are going to be clean, and that's what, that's where their bias lies, but you need to bring it back down to the numbers. The banker is going to want to generate a solid amount of net interest margin on your account. They're incented to loan you the most money possible while protecting the bank's interest. A tax accountant is going to want to minimize your taxes. A risk manager isn't going to want to push you too hard. They're going to want to keep you around the average. They're going to, for the most part, they got your best interest in mind, no doubt. I did that for the last 7 years. But at the end of the day, they don't want to push you out of your comfort zone because they don't want to be fired by you. That goes for everybody. So at the end of the day, you need to own the decisions. And so having a board of advisors, consistency. You need to, consistently meet with these people. And I'll touch on this more coming up here, but consistency is key. Set up reminders, set up meetings. Google Calendar is great to set up recurring meetings. Hey, let's touch base with the tax accountant the second week of March and July and September, and then again in December. The same with your risk management or your agronomist. Consistency is key. And the great thing about where we're at today is the connectivity. You can bring in somebody, like you could, I'm sure if you reached out to Christian Hebert and you wanted to, put together a relationship with him or somebody like him, there's probably a way where you could bring in advisors from outside of your area and use something like Zoom, Google Meet. You could collaborate on Google Docs. You could have a remote relationship that really minimizes the amount of time investment that either party has to make, but you can be as effective as possible. And at the end of the day, compensation. You tend to get what you pay for. Not always, but compensation kind of keeps everybody honest. If you're paying for advice, they are going to do everything in their power to satisfy you. You got to be careful that they don't turn into yes men or women, but compensation at the end of the day keeps them honest. So when assembling a board of advisors, meet with them consistently. It's okay to save yourself time and the advisor's time and minimize the face-to-face so you can move on to other aspects of your farm. So the connectivity, and then at the end of the day, there needs to be some sort of a compensation to get people to get the most value out of it. It's interesting. I gave our software platform away to 10 producers, and I was very disappointed with the amount of usability. And then as we started selling it, the people who paid for it, their usage dramatically increased. So there is some psychological components to having a monetary stake in a tool, an advisor, a product. So at the end of the day, the 3 C's of having a successful team around you. So moving on from a board of advisors, these producers that I've come across, they just tend to be default sellers. Their mindset is, what is stopping me from making a sale today? Not, they don't need to be beaten over the head with reasons why they should sell. They are comfortable selling grain. They're comfortable ending ownership. They know that they can't pay their bills in wheat or peas or soybeans or sugar beets, lentils, corn. So they know they have to sell. So their default nature is to sell. So what is the problem? You just have so many opinions out there, so much noise. One of the things that really annoys me is if you call in, you listen to a radio show and they say, hey, Joe, market analyst, what do you think the price of corn is going to do tomorrow? And then if that analyst says, it looks like we broke we broke some resistance and looks to be a good week ahead. If you were thinking about selling, geez, is this guy right? He's an expert. Who am I? So many opinions. Like this picture shows, you're just inundated with people, different thoughts, ideas, recipes on what is correct, what is the taste of the day. And by being a default seller, you tend to not get quite as inundated with reasons to hang on, reasons not to sell. And the other problem is, and it looks like some of our slides have gotten a little gotten strung off the bottom, but what this says is predicting the future is hard. This is a shattered crystal ball. You know, I tend to actually take some of the stuff that like Ed Seafried said on Monday night or Matt Roberts said, I definitely sprinkle that stuff with a grain of salt. The amount of people that predicted the 2012, I certainly don't know them. You know, they're very well pronounced or well advertised weather newsletter that was predicting $6 corn in 2016. I think we've seen this enough, or if you've been farming enough, you should know that predicting the future is really, really hard. And there's always going to be some piece of news that meets whatever bias you have. If you lean a little bullish, you can find 10 news articles that support that. If you lean a little bearish, you find 10 news articles. And if at the end of the day, you know, I need to sell my grain, what's stopping me from selling the grain? Using the seasonalities like Ed Ossett talks about and like we talk about a lot. You just need to, confirmation bias. Somebody commented there. Confirmation bias, you know, can be a killer in today's era of endless amounts of information. And then in addition, our emotions tend to take over. This is a grain marketing roller coaster we put out that follows the typical roller coaster you see of, you know, our emotions tend to be our worst enemy, where when prices are high, we tend to fall victim to complacency, you know, excitement, elatement. And when we go through periods of lower prices, it's so easy to get despondent, you capitulate, panic. And at the end of the day, just simply being a default seller, knowing you need to turn your grain to cash. It doesn't mean you should just sell off the combine. Doesn't mean you should just, you know, dump it all as soon as it comes off the field. But just that slight difference in approach I've noticed in these traits of successful farmers. And so what's a solution to help with this? If we're looking at 3 different time periods, we have the past, we have today, we have the future. I really think we need to focus, we need to reduce our fixation on past decisions. Anytime better pricing opportunities come about, if you've made a grain sale, you know, in the last few days or in a week, it's human nature to regret a sale that looks quote unquote too cheap. But that's done. We can't fixate on it. As I just got done spending a lot of hot air on, the future is unpredictable. Let's focus on making the best decision we can today. Does today's opportunity meet our goal? Are we in a seasonally strong window of time? What factors do we know today? And reduce our emphasis on price predictions. Don't fixate on past decisions. Focus on making the best decision you can today and moving on from that. So a couple things I've really seen help guys kind of follow this logic is, instead of fixating on price per bushel, you know, in my backyard, we've been floating around this $3 cash price of corn, and it gets so easy to pick that 1 penny price target, that one, you just anchor to that one specific price. You know, for instance, for me, I have a house. I know what price I would sell that house for. And at that same time, I can't anchor to that price. You have to be flexible with your price targets. And to me, it's a lot easier with your P&L and your balance sheet in mind. If I sell today, does it meet my objective of protecting my cash flow? Does it meet my objective of growing my working capital? How does it impact my net worth? And if you can meet those goals, there, you know, oftentimes the last 2 years we haven't met those goals. But once you can meet those goals, and you know, as Matt said, it's aided by being a lower cost producer on a per unit of production basis. Once you can meet those goals, it makes it a lot easier to pull the trigger on these decisions. And as Ed talked about, as we walked through his pre-harvest marketing plan, having price and date targets, and both of those are very important. Having a price target and a date target to sell your grain just reduces that uncertainty, and you're anchoring to the uncertainty that's comes along with volatile commodity markets. I've seen a couple guys build a marketing plan. Well, we have it in our software. You can build a marketing plan in there with both price targets and date targets, but even using Google Calendar. So, Ed says selling, one of his characters sells in May. You could go and, every Tuesday and Thursday in the month of May and the first week in June, you could put a reminder, we need to be thinking hard about liquidating our old crop and layering on some new crop protection. So once again, reducing the impact of the noise and all the opinions on your decision making and making it more objective. And then Ed didn't talk about it too much, but he really hammers home the point that higher prices are good. If anybody's on my email list, they've heard a story I shared. I got woke up about 5 a.m. one day this summer. I know a producer, and I'm good friends with him. His break even on wheat 550 bushel. This is spring wheat. It's a little higher cost of production than soft winter wheat or hard winter wheat. His break even is 550. For a lot of the winter, we were 450, 475 cash price. All of a sudden, the market shot up. He made a sale which would net him about $6 cash price, assuming a good basis. Well, he called me super early one morning, just in a panic. What are we going to do? I'm in such a, I can't believe I'm in the situation I am today. Just really, really stressing out. And I thought he got hailed out, but no, he had 30% of his wheat contracted, and the market was now $1 higher. And to me, what an unbelievable gift. Forever, myself, if you're going to ignore opinions, I was putting out plenty of stuff. Wheat is terrible. I was looking at the margin opportunities. Oh, wheat is gross. Well, we get a weather issue, and what do you know? Wheat rallies $3 a bushel, and now all of a sudden this guy goes from a potential $50 an acre loss to maybe pushing $100 an acre profit. That is good. And he was fixating on that one sale he made that was just really hampering his decision making in the process, and frankly just causing him a tremendous amount of undue stress. When you take into account he owns a lot of equipment, he owns a lot of land, he's going to be farming in 2018, 2019, 2020. Higher prices are good. That fear is probably in the off the plate for most people. Yeah, no crap, Nick. We know higher prices are good, but I rode through that spring wheat rally this year. A lot of you rode through the $3 rally we had in the soybean market in 2016. It doesn't necessarily feel so good after that rally, especially if you've been selling the whole time. But just always remember, higher prices are good. And then at the end of the day, we have to turn our crop to cash. If you have any sort of debt, holding your inventory for long periods of time isn't free. So realizing that if you can decrease the amount or the time that you have that operating note out there, that can easily end up being one of a sizable portion of Christian Hebert's 5% rule, is just by minimizing the amount of time you're paying interest, and being a default seller helps that. So the fourth one, kind of continuing along the path of grain marketing, is separating the futures and basis with the goal of optimizing your cash price. So what is the problem? Well, the problem is, here we're going with a couple of really simple charts. We have two arrows here, one arrow up, the other arrow down. We'll say that up represents strength and down represents weakness. When historically, this isn't always true, like any of this, nothing is 100%. When futures are up, basis tends to weaken. When futures fall, basis tends to strengthen. And I'm saying that in the position of a farmer who has long exposure to basis. And so oftentimes the best futures opportunities come when we don't see the best basis opportunities. And the reverse of that is true. Historically, the best basis of the year can come at times where the futures market isn't in our seasonally strong window of the year. And then in addition to it, if you know that negotiating a good basis, can add 5, 10 cents, or maybe not even negotiating, I should say, lining up your basis transaction during a period of basis strength, you can, potentially, and I hate to throw out numbers because all this is uncertain, but we've seen net basis appreciation after interest in many areas on wheat and corn specifically, 20, 25 cents a bushel. So if you know you can pick up 20, 25 cents a bushel, especially if you combine that with negotiating bigger transactions, this little slice here that we're showing, it's hard to sell much more than that of your production at one time. So during these opportune times when you can lock in historically good basis, why don't we target big chunks of our sales? So instead of just taking advantage of those little slivers, if you separate your futures and basis, you can make much bigger negotiated sales on the basis side of things than what we can do on the future side of things. The amount of sales I've seen, or cash sales forward contracts that represent more than half of a crop, are next to none. It's really, really hard to do. If you separate the futures and basis, you can make 5, 10, 15, 20% incremental sales on the futures, and then you can take big chunks. You can use your bushels for leverage for negotiating, and separating those two sides of your grain marketing is what allows you to do that. We have jump in with a quick question here. Dale asks, what do you think of basis setting 9, 10 months before harvest on a regular basis? You can't really answer that question. It comes down to a local market. In our specific local market, when China comes to market to buy soybeans in August, we tend to see the best soybean basis of the year in August. We tend to see a pretty good basis appreciation in the first couple months after harvest on both corn, wheat, and soybeans. And then during planting can be our third window. Those windows vary from geography to geography. So the next slide is, what is the solution? How can you better separate the basis and the futures? A person your job at any one time is to have these 2 meters in your head, or in a piece of software, in a spreadsheet, to know, all right, to look at today's basis, that is historically weak. Looking at today's futures, that's a marginally profitable futures, but we are in a seasonally strong time of the year, so our default is to make a sale. So you should have these 2 gauges, kind of always running on where are futures at, where is basis at. If you get them all leaning to the left, I think this is to the left for you, that would be time to do nothing. You get them both leaning to the right, you just sell the grain and be done with it. But oftentimes, they're going to be moving in not in tandem, I should say. They move opposite. So your job as a farmer, as a business-oriented producer, is to always be tracking this. So your basis is tracked on where are we at relative to our historical ranges, and the future side is where are we at based on your projected profitability. And I do want to layer on another component: where in the calendar are we? If we're in October, November, and we're looking at a futures price that is at a slight loss, we don't need to panic because we know that's not the seasonally strong time of the year. If we're out in May, June, early July, April, and the market has a bunch of carry and we're looking at a profitable price, our default should be to sell. So just constantly be having, you should at least know where today's opportunities are on the scale of your farm. Because once again, if you can reduce the fixation on where are we going, what's going to happen, and make the best decision we can today, that can be a strong way to get off that emotional roller coaster. Jeff asks, when are these gauges going to be added to the Harvest Profit dashboard? We're working on something interesting that isn't quite like this, but we'll talk about that more in a couple months, Jeff, and any other customers we have on here. That's got some neat things in the pipeline there. Once again, it's your job to know these two on a daily basis. Just because we're on one end of the spectrum doesn't mean we're going to just automatically go, go from historically weak to historically very strong, or from unprofitable to profitable. But it can add definition to your decision in a very uncertain, volatile climate. So, what are some tools to separate to make it easier for you to separate your futures and basis? I'm going to give you a number extra in addition to this. GeoGrain has cash grain bids. FBN has cash grain bids. DTN AgriCharts. There's a number of different sources for historical basis. Maybe I really don't think I'm an outlier. I can look at any one of our local basis numbers and tell you where we're at in the historical range. And frankly, I think you can do the same, just building up that institutional knowledge and sitting down with your grain merchandiser and just saying, hey, what basis ranges have we seen the last 5 or 10 years? Most grain merchandisers, obviously, they want to make their margin on your sale, but most of the merchandisers I know and work with are very helpful, in helping you define what is a good basis, what is a poor basis. On the future side of things, it all comes down to managing your profitability in a spreadsheet, on paper. Heck, do it on paper if you want, or a tool like Harvest Profit, or any of the number of other farm budgeting tools. And then Google has a really great hedging guide that talks about separating futures and basis, and why would you select board traded tools. So if you just Google CME hedging guide, and you might have to attach the word grains to that. I think it's called the CME's Grain and Oilseeds Hedging Guide. It's a really great resource that I think every farmer should read from front to back. And then if you just remember that this is an opportunity to make 20 cents a year, 20 cents, 20 cents, 20 cents, 20 cents. If anybody if you're at your beginning stage of your farming career and your cost of capital is 5%, if you take 20 cents per bushel and divide that by 5%, that gives you a long-term value to you net of $10 a bushel of value. So as you're thinking about grain storage, if grain storage costs $1.50 to $2 a bushel, this 20-cent return is just such a home run. And I know you're not going to act like a grain elevator and have all of your grain hedged in your bin, but just separating those two is definitely a trait I've seen of successful farms. And combined with the knowledge that you're never going to be 100% correct, but I think that over the long term, this in itself can get you to be 5% better, this one decision. So that plays right into trait number 5. These last ones are going to be a little quicker, but on-farm storage. On-farm storage isn't free. It can be as low as $1 a bushel and as high as $2 to $3 a bushel. So it's definitely a strong investment, or a hefty investment you have to make into your farm. But on-farm storage is a key trait of nearly all of the what I would call bulletproof farmers that I've met over the years. And the storage isn't used as an excuse to not do risk management. It's used as a tool to help facilitate risk management. So if anybody knows, I like to talk about this grain drying, and don't pick apart these numbers too much, because obviously they vary from farm to farm, from geography to geography, much different based on prices of propane, prices of natural gas. But if the typical commercial drying costs 5 cents a point, and on-farm drying is 2 cents a point, and if the extra commercial shrink My brain's a little fried today with the busyness we've had here, but if I remember right, actual shrink is 1.18%. A lot of elevators charge 1.4 to 1.5% shrink. So that, that ends up being 0.3 to 0.4% extra shrink. Just to be conservative, I'm using 0.25% extra shrink per point. So if you dry $3.50 corn, take 5 points out of it, it is 19 cents a bushel cheaper to do that on the farm. So if you look at your basis gain, and once again, these are estimates. Basis gains historically gross 15 to 20 cents. If you look at 15, 20 cents of market carry, we're looking at 30 to 40 cents of gross gain in basis and carry. And the carry just doesn't magically appear, as we've seen with corn trading around 350 futures for months on end. It seems like you have to sell the carry to get the carry. And that's a lesson for another day. But there are huge opportunities that come along with your grain storage. Tom says actual shrink is 1.15%. Very close to the 1.18% that I had there in my mind. So if you take off interest and take off utilities, you'd be looking at, let's just say 20 cents a bushel in gain. And that goes back to the previous slide where I mentioned 20-cent annual gains by separating the futures and the basis. So 20 cents plus 19 cents for the drying, we're starting to see some pretty big sizable numbers in returns on that grain storage. And I'll keep saying it, a farmer's not going to hedge 100% of their grain like a grain elevator does. But I think, if you take that 20-cent gain and chop it down to 10 cents and throw on the drying, it's really just a no-brainer investment, specifically for crops that need to be dried, like corn, and crops that have carry, like wheat. Soybeans is a little bit of a different story, because if you take 4.5% operating interest on a $9 soybean product, that ends up being about 40 cents a year in interest versus 12 cents a year in corn and wheat. So the solution, or the other problem is, if you have grain storage, you're not paying commercial storage. That 5 cents a month is like, I'm here in Fargo, North Dakota today, where the wind is always howling. Go out for a jog when the wind is blowing 30 miles an hour, or go for a bike ride and see how productive you are. That's kind of like marketing your grain with a commercial storage headwind. Not easy to do. And then it also minimizes the chance of reactive basis contracts, bringing it to town at harvest. You don't want to sell because the futures price is terrible. So the elevator says you can sell it cash, or you can put on a basis contract. So you put on a basis contract to just kick the can down the road. And what do you know? It's also the worst basis of the year. So you're paying the market carry, you're paying the basis, which essentially is you're just paying the storage. So the problem is, we don't want to be forced to use those costly tools. Solution, whoa, what do you know? Storage. Isn't that the obvious statement? The ability to have the trait of having on-farm storage is actually having the storage. And supplementing that is our knowledge of futures and basis, and actually using your storage as a tool to merchandise your grain and not to speculate. There's plenty of logistical benefits to grain storage, being able to get your crop off in a timely manner. But at the end of the day, a thorough knowledge of futures and basis, whether that's talking to your grain merchandiser, talking to a broker, working with a broker, the CME's hedging guide, our business of farming course really takes a deep dive into the futures and basis side in thinking like a merchandiser. Then you need to have the liquidity, you need to have the balance sheet. Where grain storage really becomes a no-brainer is if you only, let's say you only have 20-30% working capital as either a percentage of revenue or a percentage of costs, then the interest burden on your inventory is a lot less. And if you're going to truly turn your grain storage into a grain merchandising program, like an elevator would, you really need to have a supportive banker. Nothing like getting walloped with daily margin calls for 2 weeks in a row to cause you to make a panic decision and lift some hedges and really blow up your marketing plan. So having a supportive banker, if you're going to combine these two traits of using grain storage, using futures, And I should step back. Using futures doesn't mean you have to use futures hedges. It can be a hedge to arrive. So you can do the futures hedging through the elevator. I like having the open delivery with a futures hedge, but you don't have to. But having a supportive banker is really key. And if you're going to implement a true grain merchandising, commercial grain-like program on your farm. Similar to the previous trait, you need to have somewhere to get historical basis. And a lot of you, I think, that can be in your mind. The other tools we mentioned. And then one addition is a merchandising mindset is key. So transitioning from a speculative mindset to a merchandising mindset is really a key to making that grain storage just a complete no-brain investment on your farm. Trait number 6. This one is titled a little odd for a reason. A lot of the successful farms I work with have what I call as a $100 bill strainer. And what does that mean? As equipment gets more complex and equipment purchases have slowed, shop rates aren't going down. The custom rates, in addition to this, custom rates for custom spraying, you could say it's the liability that comes with dicamba and some of these different modes of action. Custom rates are going up. And in addition, there's no shortage of people that are out there trying to sell you things to help you make that 5% improvement in your farm. One of the people that's trying to sell you things is sitting right in front of you. Boop, boop. So I'm guilty of trying to sell you courses and software to help improve your farm. So it's your job to evaluate the transactions that occur in your business, and going back to the kind of what the Hefty brothers say is finding these $100 an hour jobs. So things that you aren't good at, things that you can't do on the farm, things that frankly aren't that expensive, let those go through your strainer. But if there's activities that you identify as things you could do, whether it's just scouting your fields or, the number one thing, in my opinion, is having a sprayer. If you don't have a sprayer and you're relying on all of it to be custom done, that is, to me, that's the highest ROI investment in the farm, especially with the prices of pull-type sprayers, but that's an aside. So just constantly be looking for ways to fine-tune the financial side of your farm. And so if I go back to this trait, $100 strainer, a less politically correct thing to say would be being a tight ass. If you're a tight ass, that's a good, solid trait. And just constantly looking at things from an ROI. That doesn't mean you can't pay for tools, you can't pay for advice, but just ensuring that you're getting value out of those items. So how do what are some tools to implement this? Reviewing your transactions at the end of the year, simply print out your transactions, print them to high to low. Whether it's seed, fertilizer, and chemical, you might need to do a little further analysis and break them down, per product, per crop. We try to make that easy in our software platform to look at stuff on a crop by crop and a field by field basis. But review your transactions. Is there anything you aren't getting value out of, or anything that you could do on your farm? And cut out things that you could do yourself. Spraying, instead of sending everything to town, try to do half of the maintenance on the farm. Maybe it's building a parts inventory on your farm. If you know you're going to use these 32 items in your shop this year, instead of just going out and buying at retail, maybe you should be building a little inventory, a little parts department on your farm. We know that the price for parts and the price for shop rates has definitely crept. Crept is probably an understatement, but crept higher. And the other trait, and then this is, I didn't want to include this because it doesn't cross everybody, but there's a number of farms that I know that do their books themselves, and they can identify these. They really have to think about every expense that goes through their farm. So being intimately familiar with your books, and potentially doing your books yourself, even though it's a pain in the butt and it's hard to stay on top of, knowing each one of those transactions is a great way to constantly be judging ROI and cutting the fat and paying, keep paying for the things that pay, cut the things that don't. The last trait here is similar to what Matt Roberts said on just always being cognizant of market cycles. Farming is cyclical. It's kind of always going to be cyclical. This is another one of Warren Buffett's quotes. When it rains gold, these guys put out the bucket and not the thimble. And when they're putting out that bucket during times of really nice profits, use those profits to build a balance sheet moat. And what that means is paying taxes. So the problem, farming is cyclical. But oftentimes it doesn't feel like it is. We tend to suffer from recency bias. This is something I really like to talk about is we tend to take what's happened in the last month or two and extrapolate that out over the next 2 or 3 years. When the wheat market rallied $3 a bushel, it was hard to envision that it was going to fall $2 a bushel by harvest, and that's what happened. We tended to take that current higher price, extrapolate that out over time, and that happens during times of higher prices and lower prices. So remember that farming is cyclical. Where are we at in the cycle? When we're in a period of higher profitability, and in hindsight it's 2020 here, obviously, but these guys, they put out the bucket and not the thimble, and they wrote some sizable checks to their government to bring that money home on the balance sheet to build a financial moat for their farm. And so, more and more people are talking about tax aversion and should you do Section 179. Obviously, if you have needs, buy them. If you have wants, think twice about them. That goes back to having a good board of advisors that will keep you financially disciplined. The solution to this is just goals, goals, goals. If you can outline goals, maybe I talked to a farmer the other day who's 28 years old, and he set out a goal that by the time he's 40, he wants to have, his operating note paid off, with the first soybean sales that he makes at the fall. So being completely debt-free in his situation, as young as he is, isn't realistic. But having that goal of having greater than 70, 80% of your expenses as your working capital allows you to make that decision. Geez, my friends say, the good times are back. Thank God for the rally. Did you hear about the crop in South America? It's burnt up. China's begging for corn. If you have that goal in mind, it can be easier to put out the bucket and not the thimble. And then it's ironic that Matt spoke about cyclicality before this. Just respect the cycles. The poor times we're in now aren't going to be around forever. Low prices don't cure low prices quite nearly as easily as high prices cure high prices. But farming is cyclical. The odds are highly likely that cyclicality is going to continue. And then just communicate your goals to your family, to your peer group, your advisors, your business partners. So when these opportunities come where you can meet your balance sheet objectives, you can make those uncomfortably large profitable decisions by being proactive with the goal in mind, not a prediction mindset. So tools here are documenting your goals, keeping them present, and reviewing them with an advisor. It goes back to Christian's presentation that he did and in the goal sheet that he has on his spreadsheet, christianhebert.com, is just keep your goals at the top of the mind. Print them up, put them on the wall, communicate them with your advisor, set reminders in your Google Calendar. Just keep your goals present. When these cyclical upturns happen, it's super hard to make sizable, proactive, profitable decisions when it feels like, it's always going to feel, it's human nature to be complacent during times of great profit opportunities. And a lot of the farms that are in a really solid financial situation, they took advantage of the good times when they were here. Then in addition to it, just kind of, lay out your metrics, just know your weaknesses. This gets back to focus on attacking your weaknesses and focusing on your strength. And that can be a people, a process, an investment focus. So just identify where you're weak, where you're strong, and try to be objective and honest and fix those traits. Here are these 3 traits, all the 7 traits are listed below with some different metrics, and try to identify where you're strong, where you're weak, and highlight those goals to fix them going forward. And the common theme of this is, all of this is knowing your numbers. Knowing your numbers is key to pretty much everything that I talked about here today. Know your numbers on a crop year basis, know your numbers on a field by field basis. Just makes it so much easier to make objective decisions if you do it with your numbers in mind. If not, it's like going deer hunting blindfolded. You know, how are you ever going to be effective in that? And so the other thing is, knowing your number, playing with your numbers can be fun. Here's a text message I got from a guy named Eric Bakke. He farms northeast of Moorhead. I asked him if I could put this up here. He sent me this text message last night that Harvest Profit, you know, our software tool, is addicting. Every time he plays with it, he finds himself, you know, sitting in front of his computer a lot longer than what he wants to. And just knowing the numbers, it doesn't have to be in our tool. It doesn't have to be using Harvest Profit. It can be in a spreadsheet. It can be in a competitor software. It reduces the amount that you're tied to the everyday cyclicality and the everyday volatility. And it can be fun. It's fun to know your numbers. It's fun to control what you can control, let go of the things you can't control, and focus on buying more of the things that pay and cutting the things that don't pay. So at the end of the day, know your numbers. That is the number one trait I've came across among all farms, and each one of these is just a little piece of that pie. I figured there was no way I was going to talk until 2:30, and here we are. So I hope that was valuable for you guys. My preaching gets a little bit repetitive. I know I'm going to repeat this stuff for the next 30 years of my career, but it's what I'm passionate about. I've seen the seeds of the success of farmers who sow these behaviors and these traits and these processes. So with that, we're done with this. We're going to transition over to a little bit of a different topic with Jack Aldris, just talking about technology and the pace of technology changing, and from somebody that's outside of a farm, who isn't specifically involved with agriculture. So we will see you again here in a couple minutes. Thank you, guys.